She adjusted the strap of her apron and looked at herself in the small mirror inside the staff restroom. The bright lights above her head made her look more tired than she felt, but she gave herself a small smile anyway. It had been a long week already, and it was only Friday. Tonight's event was important. The manager had repeated that at least 3 times during the afternoon briefing. The venue was known for hosting high-end private parties. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Round tables were covered in white cloth so smooth they almost shined. Every glass sparkled. Every fork was perfectly aligned. Even the air smelled expensive, filled with soft perfume and fresh flowers arranged in tall vases around the hall. She had worked at the venue for nearly 2 years, long enough to know how these nights usually went. Wealthy guests would arrive in designer clothes, laugh loudly, take pictures, and rarely notice the staff moving quietly around them. She did not mind being invisible. In many ways, it made her job easier. She picked up a silver tray and stepped into the ballroom. The grand piano stood near the center of the room, polished so perfectly that the chandelier lights reflected on its surface. It was placed there as part of the decoration, though a professional pianist had been hired to perform later in the evening. Her eyes paused on it for just a second longer than necessary. There was a time when she would have walked straight toward a piano like that without fear. A time when music was not something distant or forgotten. But that was years ago, and life had moved in a different direction. She grew up in a small apartment with thin walls and a window that faced another building. Her mother worked double shifts at a laundry shop. Money was always tight, but there was always music. An old upright piano had once stood in the corner of their living room. It was slightly out of tune and scratched along the edges, but to her it was perfect. She started playing when she was 8. A neighbor who used to teach music noticed her tapping rhythms on the staircase railing and offered to give her lessons at a low cost. From the first day her fingers touched the keys, something inside her felt awake. She did not just play notes. She felt them. Her teacher used to say she had rare timing and deep emotion for someone so young. She would practice for hours after school, ignoring the noise from the street outside. When she played, the world became quiet. But as she grew older, reality slowly pushed music into the background. Bills increased. Her mother's health became weaker. The lessons stopped first. Then the piano had to be sold. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would return to it one day. One day turned into years. Now, at 24, she carried trays instead of sheet music. She memorized table numbers instead of melodies. She smiled at guests instead of performing for them. It was not the life she had once imagined, but she never allowed herself to feel bitter about it. Survival came first. The guests began arriving just after 7 in the evening. Luxury cars pulled up outside the glass entrance. Laughter echoed across the marble floor. The host of the party, a well-known businessman in the city, walked around greeting everyone with confident energy. This celebration marked a major success for his company, and no detail had been spared. She moved carefully between the tables, offering drinks and small plates of appetizers. Some guests thanked her politely. Others barely made eye contact. She was used to both reactions. As the room filled, soft instrumental music played through the speakers to set the mood. The hired pianist was expected to begin the live performance shortly after dinner. She tried not to look at the grand piano again, but it kept pulling her attention. Its lid was slightly raised, waiting, almost as if it knew it would soon be heard. During a short break near the service table, she allowed herself a small risk. She walked past the piano while checking the floral arrangements and lightly brushed her fingers against the edge of the keys. It was a quick, harmless touch. The cool, smooth surface sent a familiar feeling up her arm. She quickly pulled her hand back, glancing around to make sure no one noticed. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been for such a small action. It surprised her how memory lived inside the body. Even after years without practice, her fingers still remembered the shape of the keys, the distance between chords, the gentle pressure needed to create soft sound. "Focus," she whispered to herself. There was work to do. Dinner service began smoothly. Plates moved out of the kitchen in perfect order. The smell of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables filled the hall. Guests continued to talk about business deals, vacations, and investment plans. Laughter grew louder as wine glasses emptied. Time passed, and a small tension began to form behind the scenes. The hired pianist had not yet arrived. The manager checked his phone repeatedly. A quiet conversation happened near the entrance. Something was clearly wrong. She overheard only a few words while placing a dessert spoon beside a plate. Traffic accident. Can't make it. No replacement available. The manager's expression tightened. Live music had been advertised as one of the highlights of the evening. Without it, the atmosphere would feel incomplete. The host was informed shortly after. From across the room, she noticed his confident smile fade for a brief moment before he forced it back into place. He did not want his guests to sense a problem. But whispers began spreading anyway. Where's the pianist? Isn't there supposed to be live music? The recorded background music continued playing, but it felt different now. Artificial. Empty. She kept working, reminding herself that none of this concerned her. She was staff. Problems like this were above her position. Still, the grand piano stood there in silence, waiting. As dessert was served, she found herself near it again. The room was busy. Conversations overlapped. No one was paying attention to her. Almost without thinking, she lifted the piano lid just slightly higher and pressed one single key. The note rang softly through the air. It was perfectly in tune. She froze immediately, afraid someone would scold her. But the sound was swallowed by the noise of the crowd. No one seemed to notice. For a brief second, she imagined sitting down properly, placing both hands on the keys, letting a real melody flow into the room instead of recorded tracks. The thought felt impossible. She closed the lid gently and stepped away. Across the hall, the host spoke quietly with the manager again. His expression now showed clear frustration. He scanned the room as if searching for a solution. The night was far from over. She had no idea that this quiet moment, this simple touch of a key, would soon pull her into the center of attention. For now, she remained what she had always been in this place. A hard-working waitress moving between tables, unseen and unheard. But something inside her had shifted. The piano was no longer just decoration. It was a reminder. And reminders have a way of changing everything. The tension in the ballroom slowly became harder to ignore. At first, most guests were too busy eating and talking to notice that something was missing. But as dinner plates were cleared and dessert forks rested on empty dishes, people began looking toward the grand piano. It remained silent. The recorded background music kept playing through hidden speakers, but it did not carry the same warmth as live performance. Felt flat. Predictable. A few guests even glanced at their watches. Behind the scenes, the manager's calm voice had turned sharp. He moved quickly between the kitchen and the entrance, phone pressed tightly to his ear. There was no replacement musician available on such short notice. The accident that delayed the hired pianist had blocked the main road into the city. There was simply no way he could arrive in time. The host stood near the center of the room, trying to keep his smile in place. He laughed loudly at a joke someone made, but his eyes kept drifting toward the piano. This evening was important to him. He had invited business partners, investors, and close friends. Everything had to be perfect. She continued clearing plates, pretending not to notice the growing problem. It was safer that way. Staff members were trained to stay quiet and invisible when things went wrong. While placing a tray of empty glasses near the service table, she overheard two guests talking. "I thought there would be live music." "Maybe later," the other replied, though his voice did not sound convinced. The manager suddenly stepped toward the staff area and gathered the servers together for a quick whispering discussion. "Listen," he said under his breath, trying not to attract attention. "The pianist isn't coming. We need to keep the atmosphere lively. Smile more. Move confidently. Don't let guests feel the gap." The staff nodded. They were used to solving small crises quietly. She kept her head down, but her heart began beating faster. She did not know why. Maybe it was because the piano stood so close. Maybe it was because she knew deep inside, that she could fill that silence. But that thought felt too big, too risky. She was carrying a tray of fresh drinks when one of the younger guests, clearly amused by the situation, walked toward the piano and pressed a random key. The loud, uneven note caused a few people nearby to laugh. "Careful," someone joked. "You might be tonight's entertainment." The group laughed again. The host noticed the small scene and quickly walked over, placing a hand on the piano lid as if protecting it. "Let's not damage the instrument," he said lightly, though irritation flashed across his face. She happened to be standing just a few steps away when the host turned and looked directly at her. "You," he said, gesturing casually. "Do you know how to play?" For a second, she thought he was joking. She hesitated. "A little," she answered softly, not wanting to lie but also not wanting to invite tension. A few nearby guests overheard and laughed in surprise. "A little?" someone repeated playfully. The host raised his eyebrows. "Well, that's more than we have at the moment." The tone in his voice was light, but there was something else underneath it. A challenge. A hint of desperation. She felt heat rush to her face. "I haven't played in years," she added quickly. "That's fine," he replied. "We're all friends here. Just something simple, until we figure out another solution." The guests around them watched with growing interest. What had started as a minor inconvenience was now turning into entertainment. She looked toward the manager, silently asking for help. He seemed unsure but gave a small nod. In his mind, even a short attempt would be better than silence. Her hands felt cold. She placed the drink tray down carefully, as if delaying the moment. Every step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. She was aware of the eyes following her. Some curious, some amused, some doubtful. She had served these people all evening. Now they were watching her for a completely different reason. As she reached the piano bench, she paused. The room grew quieter, not because someone had asked for silence, but because curiosity naturally pulled attention toward her. She sat down slowly. The bench felt unfamiliar, harder than she remembered. She adjusted her posture, trying to ignore the sound of her own breathing. The host stood nearby with folded arms, smiling confidently as if this was part of his original plan. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested he expected something small and harmless. She lifted the piano lid fully this time. The polished wood reflected her nervous expression. For a moment, she considered standing up and walking away. She could pretend she suddenly felt unwell. She could say she remembered something urgent in the kitchen. It would be easy to escape. But then she looked at the keys. They were clean, smooth, waiting. Her fingers hovered above them, slightly trembling. She pressed one key gently. The sound was clear and strong. A second note followed. Then a third. The first few notes formed a simple melody she had learned as a child. Nothing complicated, just soft and steady. Her fingers moved carefully, as if testing whether they still remembered the path. At first, a few guests continued whispering among themselves. Someone near the back checked his phone. It was exactly what she had feared, background noise to polite conversation. But she did not stop. She closed her eyes for a second and let her hands relax. Instead of thinking about the audience, she focused on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. The familiar spacing, the rise and fall of sound. Slowly, her breathing steadied. She allowed the melody to grow deeper, added harmony with her left hand. Let the notes connect instead of standing alone. Something changed. The sound began to fill the room in a way the speakers never could. It wrapped around conversations and gently quieted them. One by one, voices faded. A woman near the front turned fully toward the piano. A man who had been laughing moments earlier lowered his glass and listened. She felt it happen before she saw it. That shift in energy when people stop hearing and start listening. Her fear slowly transformed into focus. The years without practice did not disappear, but muscle memory began waking up inside her hands. She remembered transitions between chords, the slight pressure needed to make softer tones, the way to build emotion without rushing. She moved into a more complex piece, something she used to practice late at night when the world outside her childhood window had gone quiet. Her fingers were no longer trembling. They were dancing. The host's smile slowly faded, replaced by something else. Surprise, maybe even respect. The guests were no longer amused. They were silent. The melody rose gently, then dipped low and thoughtful, carried feeling that did not need words. Even those who knew nothing about music could sense the difference. This was not random playing. This was not luck. This was someone who understood the instrument. She forgot about her apron, forgot about the tray waiting near the service table, forgot about the wealthy guests and their expectations. For those few minutes, she was not a waitress. She was simply a musician. And the room, once filled with noise and distraction, now belonged to the sound of her hands moving across black and white keys. She did not know how long she had been playing when she finally reached a gentle pause in the music. The final note lingered in the air. No one spoke. Not yet. She opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid of what she would see. The entire room was facing her. For a few seconds after the final note faded, the silence felt heavier than the music itself. She remained seated, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. It was loud, almost distracting. Then the applause began. It started with one person near the front. A slow clap, almost uncertain. Then another joined. Within moments, the entire ballroom filled with sound. It was not polite clapping. It was strong and real. Some guests even stood up. She felt frozen in place. This was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for quiet embarrassment. Maybe a few awkward smiles. Maybe gentle laughter. Instead, she was looking at a room full of people who seemed honestly moved. She slowly stood from the bench. Her legs felt weak, but she managed to offer a small, shy nod. She did not know what to say. She was not used to being the center of attention. The host stepped forward first. His expression had changed completely. The playful tone from earlier was gone. "I had no idea," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "You've been hiding this?" His voice carried a mix of surprise and something close to admiration. She shook her head slightly. "I haven't played in a long time," she replied honestly. "Doesn't look like it," someone from the crowd said. A few guests gathered closer around the piano now. Their faces were different from before. There was curiosity in their eyes, but not the playful kind. It was the kind people have when they discover something unexpected and valuable. "What did you just play?" a woman asked gently. She hesitated. "It's something I used to practice when I was younger. I don't even remember the full name anymore." That was partly true. The piece had blended over the years with her own memory and feeling. It no longer belonged to sheet music alone. The manager approached quietly from the side. Instead of looking worried as he had earlier, he now looked relieved. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. Guests were talking about the performance instead of the missing pianist. "Would you be willing to play a little more?" he asked softly, careful not to pressure her. The request hung in the air. She looked at the piano again. Something inside her felt awake in a way she had not experienced for years. But with that awakening came fear. The first piece had flowed naturally. What if the second one did not? What if she made a mistake now that everyone expected something impressive? Her mind began filling with doubt. She was still wearing her apron, still a staff member. These were important guests. What if she disappointed them? What if the applause had just been excitement from the surprise? The host sensed her hesitation. "No pressure," he said, though the entire room was clearly hoping she would continue. "Only if you want to." She took a slow breath. In that moment, she realized something important. She had already crossed the biggest line. She had already played. The fear of starting was gone. Now it was only about trusting herself. She sat down again. This time, the silence in the room felt different. It was no longer curious. It was respectful. She placed her fingers on the keys and allowed herself to think of her childhood apartment. The small living room. The old upright piano with chipped paint. Her mother sitting on the worn sofa after a long day of work. listening quietly while pretending not to be tired. She remembered playing not for applause, but for comfort. She began with a softer melody this time, slower, more emotional. The notes carried something deeper than technique. They carried memory. As she played, she stopped worrying about perfection. A few notes were not as sharp as they once would have been. Her hands were not as fast as they used to be. But what she lacked in speed, she made up for in feeling. The room remained completely still. A man near the back lowered himself into a chair without taking his eyes off her. A couple who had been discussing business earlier now stood close together, listening quietly. The music built gradually. She let the melody rise and fall like breathing. She allowed small pauses between phrases, giving the note space to settle. For the first time that night, she felt fully present. Not as a waitress, not as someone trying to impress wealthy strangers, but as herself. Halfway through the piece, she felt her confidence return more strongly. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved more freely across the keyboard. She added small variations, letting creativity guide her instead of strict memory. The sound filled the high ceiling and echoed softly against the walls. It blended beautifully with the glow of the chandeliers and the soft candlelight on the tables. When she reached the final section, she let the music swell gently before bringing it back down to a quiet finish. This time, the silence after the last note felt peaceful instead of tense. Then the applause returned, louder than before. Some guests stood up fully now. A few even cheered. She felt tears press lightly against her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She did not want to cry in front of everyone. The host stepped forward again, this time clapping with genuine enthusiasm. "You just saved my evening," he said with a small laugh. "No, you did more than that. You made it unforgettable." She smiled politely, unsure how to respond. A guest from across the room approached with a thoughtful expression. He looked older, calm, observant. "Have you studied professionally?" he asked. She shook her head. "I had lessons when I was younger, but I had to stop." "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. She hesitated before answering. "Life happened," she said quietly. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than her short explanation revealed. Around them, conversations restarted, but now they were centered around her performance. "Can you believe she works here? That was incredible. I thought it was going to be awkward at first." The comments reached her ears, but they no longer felt sharp. They felt honest. The manager gently touched her shoulder. "Take a few minutes," he whispered. "We'll handle the floor." It was the first time in 2 years that someone had told her to rest during a shift without complaint. She stepped away from the piano slowly, feeling as if she had walked out of a dream. As she moved toward the staff hallway, she passed by the mirror near the entrance. For a moment, she did not recognize the person looking back at her. Her cheeks were slightly flushed. Her eyes looked brighter than usual. There was something alive in her expression. She realized that the part of her she thought had disappeared was still there. It had just been waiting. Behind her, the guests continued talking about the performance. The host was smiling again, but this time the smile looked natural. The grand piano remained at the center of the room, no longer just decoration. It had become the heart of the evening, and she, still wearing her simple black apron, had been the one to wake it up. She thought the night might slowly return to normal after that. She expected to pick up her tray again, return to her usual rhythm, and let the moment fade into memory. But the night had already changed direction, and there was no going back. As she stepped into the staff hallway, her hands were still slightly shaking. Not from fear this time, but from something stronger. It felt like energy moving through her body, like she had opened a door that had been locked for years. One of the other servers rushed toward her with wide eyes. "I didn't know you could play like that," he whispered. She gave a small laugh. "I didn't know either." It was half a joke, half the truth. The manager appeared moments later. His voice was calm, but there was excitement behind it. "The guests are asking for more," he said, "especially the host. He wants you to play again after the short speech." She blinked. Again. He nodded. Only if you're comfortable. But this is good for the event. Very good. She understood what he meant. The missing pianist was no longer a problem. People were smiling again. Some were even recording short clips on their phones. The mood had completely shifted from disappointment to admiration. Still, she felt a small wave of worry return. The first performances had come from memory and emotion. But how many pieces could she truly remember? What if she ran out? What if her confidence faded in front of everyone? She leaned against the wall for a moment and closed her eyes. She reminded herself that she had nothing to prove. She was not competing with anyone. She was simply sharing something that once belonged to her. From the ballroom, she could hear the host tapping a glass lightly to gather attention. She stepped back toward the entrance and quietly stood near the side curtain, watching. The host thanked everyone for attending. He spoke about hard work, growth, and the journey of building success. His speech was polished, practiced. The guests listened respectfully. Then he paused and smiled. Tonight, he said, we had an unexpected surprise. Sometimes the best moments are the ones we never plan. I would like to invite our very talented staff member to play once more. All eyes turned toward her again. Her heart jumped, but this time she did not feel the same fear. There was still nervousness, yes, but beneath it, there was something steady. She walked back to the piano without rushing. The applause welcomed her before she even sat down. She adjusted the bench, took a slow breath, and placed her hands on the keys. Instead of starting immediately, she looked around the room. These were not just wealthy guests anymore. They were people listening. Some looked curious. Some looked thoughtful. A few looked emotional. She began with a soft introduction, letting the notes fall gently into the space. This time she chose something more powerful. A piece that built slowly but carried strength in its middle section. It was something she used to struggle with as a teenager because it required control and patience. Her fingers moved carefully at first, then more confidently as the melody unfolded. The room once again became still, but this time she felt connected to it. She could sense the audience breathing with the music. When she slowed down, they leaned in slightly. When she let the notes rise, she could feel their attention lift with them. Halfway through the piece, she noticed the older guest who had asked about her training earlier. He was standing closer now, watching her hands with focused interest. Not in a critical way, in a thoughtful way. She played through the most difficult section without stopping. A small mistake brushed past, but she did not let it shake her. She continued smoothly, letting emotion carry the sound forward. By the time she reached the final chords, the energy in the room felt warm and full. When the last note settled, the applause came immediately. Strong. Genuine. Some guests even called out words of praise. She stood again, her face slightly flushed but calm. The host stepped forward and, without hesitation, shook her hand. It was a different gesture from earlier. There was respect in it now. You have real talent, he said quietly so only she could hear. I hope you know that. She nodded, unsure how to answer. Compliments still felt unfamiliar. As the applause slowly faded, the older guest approached her directly. May I ask you something? He said politely. Of course. When was the last time you practiced seriously? She thought for a moment. Years ago. He studied her expression, then nodded slowly. Talent like that does not disappear. It waits. His words stayed with her. He introduced himself as someone connected to a local music academy. Not as a boast but simply as fact. He explained that he attended events like this often, more out of obligation than interest. But tonight, he said, glancing toward the piano. I'm glad I came. She felt her chest tighten slightly. He handed her a simple business card. Nothing dramatic. No loud promises. If you ever consider playing again more seriously, call me, he said. There are options. Scholarships. Additions. Not guarantees. But chances. Chances. It was a word she had not allowed herself to think about in a long time. Before she could respond properly, another guest approached to compliment her. Then another. For the first time in her job at the venue, people were asking her questions about herself instead of what drink they wanted. What inspired you? Where did you learn? Do you perform anywhere else? She answered honestly. She did not exaggerate her past or pretend to be more experienced than she was. She simply told the truth, that she had loved music once and had not touched a piano in years until tonight. The reactions were not pity. They were admiration. Eventually, the manager gently reminded her that the shift was not officially over. She returned to her duties, but something felt different. When she carried trays now, guests thanked her with warmer smiles. Some even mentioned the performance again. The piano remained open, no longer silent decoration. And though she was back to serving drinks and clearing plates, she did not feel invisible anymore. Later that night, as the event slowly came to an end and guests began leaving, she stood near the doorway watching the final cars pull away. The ballroom was quieter now. Only staff remained, cleaning and resetting the space. She walked back to the piano one last time before it was closed. She ran her fingers lightly across the keys, not playing a full piece, just touching them gently. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though she was not sure if she meant the instrument, the night, or herself. The manager approached from behind. "You did something special tonight," he said. "Not just for the guests. For yourself." She nodded slowly. As she untied her apron and placed it in her locker, she felt a quiet thought forming in her mind. For years, she had believed that part of her life was over. But maybe it had only been paused. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was not the end of a surprise performance. Maybe it was the beginning of something she had been too afraid to imagine. She barely slept that night. Even after she returned home and changed out of her uniform, the sound of the piano stayed with her. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the chandelier lights reflecting off the polished surface. She could hear the silence of the room before the applause began. It did not feel real. Her small apartment was quiet, just as it had always been. The same narrow hallway, the same faded curtains, the same ticking wall clock in the living room. Nothing around her had changed, and yet something inside her had. She placed the business card on the small table near her bed and stared at it for a long time. It looked simple, just a name, a number, and the title of a music academy printed neatly in dark ink. Chances. The word echoed in her mind again. By morning, doubt began to return. What if the applause had just been excitement from the moment? What if they were simply impressed because they did not expect much from a waitress? Maybe in a real music hall, surrounded by trained performers, she would not stand out at all. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city outside looked ordinary. People walking to work. Buses passing by. Nothing special. She almost laughed at herself. One night of playing at a private party did not change reality. Still, she could not ignore the feeling that had woken up inside her. It was not pride. It was not ego. It was something quieter. It was belonging. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed. She assumed it was a message about her next shift. But when she looked at the screen, she saw a notification from a social media app she rarely used. Someone had tagged the venue in a short video. Her heart skipped. She hesitated before opening it. There she was, sitting at the grand piano, apron still tied around her waist. The video captured the middle of her second piece. The sound quality was not perfect, but the emotion was clear. The comments below were filling quickly. Who is she? That gave me chills. Why is she working as a waitress? Pure talent. She stared at the screen in disbelief. The video had already been shared dozens of times. Her first reaction was embarrassment. She had not agreed to be recorded. She had not prepared herself to be seen outside that room. But as she read more comments, something shifted. People were not mocking her. They were inspired by the story. They were moved by the surprise of it. The venue's official page had even reposted the clip with a caption about unexpected brilliance. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was the manager. "Have you seen the video?" he asked as soon as she answered. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's getting attention. he continued. Good attention. The host called this morning. He wants to speak with you. Her stomach tightened. About what? He didn't say much, just that he was impressed. He asked if you would be willing to perform at another private gathering next month. As a guest performer, not staff. She sat down slowly. As a guest performer. The words felt heavy and unreal. I don't know, she said honestly. That's okay, the manager replied. Think about it. But I'll say this. Opportunities don't always knock twice. After the call ended, she looked again at the business card on the table. Two different paths were now quietly standing in front of her. One felt safer. Continue working, accept the compliment, let the moment fade. The other felt uncertain, risky, full of unknowns. That evening, she did something she had not done in years. She searched for a place nearby that had a public piano available for practice. After some scrolling, she found a small community center a few streets away that allowed open access during certain hours. Her hands felt nervous as she walked there the next day. The building was simple, with plain walls and a quiet lobby. In the corner of a multipurpose room stood an upright piano. Not grand, not polished like the one at the venue, but it was real. She sat down slowly and pressed a key. The sound was softer than the grand piano's voice, but it carried warmth. She began practicing scales first. Slowly, carefully. Her fingers felt stiff at times. Some transitions were clumsy. Years without consistent training had left their mark. But she did not stop. An hour passed. Then another. She played pieces she remembered. She stumbled. She repeated difficult sections. She laughed quietly at her own mistakes. No audience. No applause. Just her and the music. When she finally stood up, her back ached slightly, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. That night, she made a decision. She picked up the business card and dialed the number. Her hand trembled slightly as the phone rang. The older guest answered. I was hoping you would call, he said warmly. She swallowed her nervousness. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. You don't need to be ready, he replied calmly. You only need to be willing. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes. He explained that the academy offered evaluations for adults returning to music. It would not be easy. There would be structured practice, theory exams, performance reviews. But there would also be guidance. There is discipline in talent, he said. But there is also joy. I saw both in your playing. After the call ended, she sat quietly for a long time. The path ahead looked challenging. But for the first time, challenge did not scare her. It excited her. A few days later, she returned to work at the venue. The staff greeted her differently now. Not dramatically, but with small smiles of recognition. The piano in the ballroom was closed that evening. There was no special event, just a smaller dinner party. As she walked past it, she paused briefly. She no longer looked at it with longing. She looked at it with promise. During her break, she received another message. This time from the host of the original party. He thanked her again for saving the evening. He confirmed his invitation for her to perform next month. This time officially arranged. Payment included. She stared at the message for a long moment. Being paid to play. The idea felt almost impossible. She typed a short reply. I would be honored. When she pressed send, a quiet smile spread across her face. Her life had not magically transformed overnight. She still wore the same uniform. She still carried trays and memorized table numbers. But something important had changed. She was no longer waiting for life to decide for her. She was choosing. And that choice, more than the applause or the attention online, was what truly marked the turning point. The girl who once sold her childhood piano to help pay bills was slowly finding her way back to the music she loved. Not because someone forced her, but because she finally allowed herself to believe she deserved the chance. The weeks that followed moved quickly, but not in a rushed way. They felt steady, like steps taken with purpose. She continued working her regular shifts at the venue, but her routine was no longer the same. Every morning before work, she visited the small community center to practice. At first, her fingers still felt unsure. Some days were frustrating. She would repeat the same section over and over, annoyed at how easily she once played it years ago. But she did not quit. There was something different about practicing now. When she was younger, she practiced because her teacher expected it, because there were exams, because she wanted to win competitions. Now she practiced because she chose to. The Music Academy evaluation was scheduled for the following month. It was not a full audition yet, just an assessment to see where she stood and what level she could enter if accepted. Even so, the thought of walking into a real music institution again made her stomach twist with nerves. At the same time, preparations were being made for the host's next private gathering. This time, her name was included on the invitation list as a featured performer. When the manager showed her the digital draft, she stared at it for a long moment. It felt strange to see herself described as a pianist. On the evening of the second event, she did not arrive in a uniform. She arrived as a guest. She wore a simple, elegant dress she had borrowed from a friend. Nothing flashy, nothing too bold, just something that made her feel comfortable and confident. As she entered the ballroom, it looked similar to the last event. The same sparkling chandeliers, the same round tables, the same polished grand piano placed at the center. But her place in the room had changed. Some guests recognized her immediately. "You're the one from last time," one woman said with a bright smile. She nodded politely. This time she did not carry trays. She did not rush between tables. She stood near the piano and greeted people who approached her with kind curiosity. The host walked over and shook her hand firmly. "I'm glad you said yes," he said. "Tonight, we planned around you." Those words stayed with her. When the moment came to perform, there was no awkward silence, no surprise request. The lights dimmed slightly. The room quieted with expectation. She walked to the piano slowly, aware of her breathing but not controlled by it. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. This time she was ready. She began with a piece she had practiced every morning for the past 2 weeks. It was gentle at first, but it carried quiet strength. Her fingers moved with confidence. Not perfect, but honest. The room listened carefully. As the music filled the space, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the applause that would come, but for the chance to sit here freely. Halfway through the performance, she allowed herself to look up briefly. The guests were still, fully present. She finished the first piece smoothly and moved into a second, slightly more complex composition. This one challenged her timing and control, but she embraced it instead of fearing it. There was a small mistake near the end. A note slightly off. In the past, that might have shaken her completely. But now she simply continued. The audience did not seem to notice. Or maybe they did, but it did not matter. When she finished, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. Some guests stood. Others wiped away quiet tears. The host stepped forward once more. "Last month, she surprised us," he said warmly. "Tonight, she reminds us what courage looks like." Courage. She had never thought of it that way. After the performance, several guests approached her with compliments. A few even asked about future performances. One mentioned a charity event. Another suggested a small cultural festival. Opportunities were appearing in ways she had never expected. But the most important moment came a few days later. She walked into the Music Academy building for her evaluation. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old sheet music. Students moved quietly between rooms carrying instrument cases. For a second, she felt like a teenager again, nervous and unsure. But she reminded herself that she had already faced a ballroom full of strangers. This was simply another room. The evaluation panel was kind but serious. They asked about her background, her training, why she stopped playing. She answered honestly. Then she sat at the piano and began. This performance felt different from the party. There were no chandeliers, no elegant dresses, no applause waiting at the end. Just 3 instructors listening closely. She played the pieces she had prepared. She focused on expression, on control, on staying calm even when her fingers felt slightly stiff. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment. One instructor leaned forward slightly. "You have natural musicality," he said. Your technique needs rebuilding. But your expression is rare. Another nodded. We would like to offer you placement in our advanced returning student program, she said. It will require discipline and time, but we believe you can grow. For a second, she did not fully understand the words. Then they settled in. Placement. Growth. She felt her throat tighten slightly. Thank you, she managed to say. When she stepped outside the building, the air felt different somehow. Brighter. She called her mother first. There was silence on the other end of the phone as she explained everything. Then her mother's voice broke softly. I always knew, she said quietly. That night, she returned to her apartment and looked around the small living room. It was still simple, still modest, but it no longer felt like a place where dreams ended. It felt like a place where new ones could begin. Months later, her schedule looked very different. She reduced her hours at the venue to part-time. The manager supported her decision, even proudly telling new staff about her story. She balanced work with classes at the academy. Theory lessons in the morning, practice sessions in the afternoon, occasional small performances in the evening. It was not always easy. There were days she felt exhausted, days she questioned whether she had started too late. But then she would sit at the piano, press the first key, and remember that night at the party. The silence before the music, the fear, the courage to begin anyway. Her journey did not turn her into a famous star overnight. There were no giant stages or television interviews. But there was something better. There was purpose. The waitress who once felt invisible in a room full of important people had discovered something powerful. That talent does not disappear just because life becomes difficult. It waits patiently, and when given even a small chance, it rises again. Years later, when she performed at her first formal recital at the academy, she wore a simple smile as she sat at the piano. The audience was not filled with wealthy business guests this time. It was filled with students, families, teachers, real listeners. She placed her hands on the keys without trembling. She did not play to prove anyone wrong. She did not play to impress. She played because she loved the sound. And that love, quiet and steady, was stronger than any applause. The night she was once forced to perform had changed her direction. But the choice to continue had changed her life. And that made all the difference.